While games like World of Warships may have you believe differently, torpedoes were generally used at relatively close range. These were powerful weapons, and some countries did develop incredibly long-range versions. For the most part, however, torpedoes were used at medium range at best. Quite often, they were used in the equivalent of barroom brawls on the high sea. There are exceptions, of course. Today's video will look at what is, often, accepted as one of the longest-range torpedo strikes in history. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, it comes from the Japanese. Their long-lance torpedoes, more accurately the Type 93, were famous for their range, which could, in theory, reach up to 40 kilometers. That was a bit optimistic, to say the least, although the Japanese would launch torpedoes at long range. In the case of the Akizuki-class destroyer Niizuki, that was at a range of 20 kilometers, or a little under 13 miles. Although, I should note this in advance. The actual distance this torpedo was fired at varies between sources. Combined Fleet notes a launch at over 6,000 meters, or 6 kilometers, which while long range, is definitely not the same as 20 kilometers. Sources will typically cite Niizuki as one of the longest range torpedoes in history, but rarely say the actual distance. So bear that in mind as we go through this video. Be it 6 kilometers or 20, this is still an impressive hit, not least for how it was done. Let's look at how that torpedo was launched, what it hit, and the result of that hit now. This action came in the early morning hours of July 5th, 1943. Niizuki was part of a formation of Japanese ships on a troop transport run. This was a common mission during the Solomon Island campaign, even after Guadalcanal was secured. On this mission, the destroyer sailed with Unagi, Nagatsuki, and Satsuki. These destroyers were doing double duty as fast transports. At the same time, an American formation was heading for Kula Gulf. 3 light cruisers and 9 destroyers covering a troop run of their own. The mission was to land troops at Rice Anchorage on New Georgia. One of the destroyers in this formation was USS Strong, a still new Fletcher-class destroyer. As the two formations, American and Japanese, sailed into Kula Gulf, they came upon one another in the darkness. Strong, joined by USS Nicholas, bombarded the shoreline. Niizuki, for her part, would become critical to the Japanese formation. This was a cloudy, dark night where visibility was poor. Rain squalls were, apparently, also an issue. This made radar a critically important thing to counter the lack of visibility. In almost any other case, that would have been an advantage for the Americans. This case would be different because Niizuki was one of the first Japanese destroyers to carry radar of her own. It wasn't as good or as advanced as American sets. But any radar is still radar is in effect here. Niizuki spotted the American group, without being spotted in turn. Her radar wasn't good enough for directing gunfire or the like, but it was good enough, given time, to figure out the bearing of the American ships, as well as their size. The Japanese identified the group as 4 cruisers and 4 destroyers. Not entirely accurate, of course, but still good enough for this action. Niizuki and her group promptly broke off instead of risking their troops. However, with a good enough bearing on the American ships, the Japanese left a parting gift. Using the information from Niizuki's radar, 3 of the destroyers launched torpedoes. Unagi launched 4, Nagatsuki launched 6, and Niizuki launched 4. This was a wave of torpedoes to cover their retreat, not to actually attack the American fleet. As it turned out, 5 minutes after the torpedoes were launched, the Japanese were sighted. USS Ralph Talbot's radar spotted the enemy, and the Americans got ready to chase them. Maybe. It's worth noting that different sources will say different things here. Combined Fleet claims that Talbot spotted the Japanese. The Dictionary of American Fighting Ships, meanwhile, says that no enemy surface forces were detected, either before or after Strong was hit. Either way, Strong was hit, and hit hard. One torpedo struck the destroyer on the port side, right amidships. This single hit blew clean through USS Strong. And this isn't an exaggeration, because the torpedo blew a hole out the starboard side of the ship. Strong's keel was about the only thing holding her together at that point, along with the upper decks. Understandably, the American ships gave up chasing the Japanese. Rescue operations began for Strong's crew, which picked most of them up. Some would be picked up later, and others would end up on various nearby islands. In the end, only 46 of the crew would perish in this action. Their ship was not so fortunate. As Strong sank, the destroyer broke in two where the torpedo had hit. Survivors reported it being a 40-degree bend as the battered frames gave way. This was, on its own, enough to sink the ship. However, as Strong went under, depth charges aboard the ship detonated. This was an incredibly violent explosion in its own right. As I went over in Strong's shipwreck video, it probably blew the ship apart. What's left of her today is scattered debris across the bottom. Niizuki, for her part, made her escape. The Japanese formation made it out without any damage. In the aftermath of Strong's sinking, it was initially attributed to a submarine torpedo, both because of recent undersea activity and because it was incredibly hard to believe that it was a destroyer torpedo, with good reason. Even acknowledging Talbot's radar contact, the distance was so great that it was difficult to accept. And if you accept the course of events where Talbot didn't detect anything, well, that just makes it more likely it was a submarine, at least to those present at the time. Of course, it wasn't a submarine. But was it actually Niizuki? Well, that's hard to say. She's most commonly credited with the hit, but there were 10 other torpedoes in the water from the other two destroyers. Nothing I've read makes any mention of why Niizuki, in particular, is credited. Perhaps it's just a general, her radar was what allowed the attack, so she gets the credit sort of thing. And, in fairness, it's probably impossible to know for sure. It could have been a torpedo from Unagi, it could have been from Nagatsuki, it could have been from Niizuki. None of them would have hit at all, in all likelihood, without the radar aboard the newest destroyer, which makes this entire thing a double feature in a way. It's possibly the longest range torpedo hit in history, and a radar-guided torpedo hit. Not in the sense of radar steering it or something, but in the context of using a radar bearing to launch the torpedoes. With the issue in determining the exact range, I think this might be the more important part of Niizuki's success. Sure, if you accept the 20-kilometer figure, she has the range going for her. But the real success of the Japanese here was in spotting the Americans first and doing it by radar, and then using the bearing to shotgun out torpedoes and sink USS Strong in a single hit. None of that would have happened had Niizuki not carried her radar. As we near the end of the video, though, I should note that Niizuki's credit is sometimes disputed by another Japanese ship, that being the heavy cruiser Haguro, which may have hit a Dutch destroyer at the Battle of the Java Sea. That was around the same range as claimed for Niizuki, with a bit more sources noting the actual range. At the same time, there were so many torpedoes in the water that it's hard to know for sure which ship fired it. Similar situation to Niizuki, but without the benefit of radar to point to, as this ship deserves the credit. Regardless, that does bring us to the end of this video. Tomorrow, as the usual Sunday video, I will take a look at Niizuki's wreck, as she was, after all, sunk the night after her fateful run-in with USS Strong. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.